I sat alone at my sister's wedding, until the groom thanked me in front of everyone. If you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible real-life stories that will leave you speechless. Your support helps us bring more content like this to you every week. I never thought I'd be the one sitting alone at my own sister's wedding. Yet there I was, tucked away at the furthest table in the corner, watching as everyone else laughed and celebrated. The white linen tablecloth in front of me was pristine, untouched by the appetizers I couldn't bring myself to eat. 5 empty chairs surrounded me at a table meant for 6. A physical representation of how isolated I'd become from my family. My sister Emma, radiant in her white dress, hadn't so much as glanced in my direction all day. The worst part wasn't the isolation. It was knowing that this was all engineered by my mother. I watched her from across the room, champagne flute in hand, laughing with her friends as if everything was perfect. As if she hadn't spent the last 3 months ensuring I would be as invisible as possible at this event. When the invitations went out, mine arrived without a +1 option. When the seating arrangements were made, I was placed at the miscellaneous table, far from any family. Even my name card had just James written on it, no Emma's brother, or any acknowledgement of my relation to the bride. I took a sip of warm champagne and contemplated leaving early. Nobody would notice. Emma was too busy with her perfect day. My father was too focused on not upsetting my mother, and my mother was too busy pretending I barely existed. I glanced at my watch. Not even 7 p.m. yet. The speeches hadn't even started. My phone buzzed with a text from my friend Mark. "How's it going?" I didn't have the energy to explain the reality, so I just replied with, "Fine," and put my phone away. What was the point? How could I explain that my own family had effectively exiled me at what should have been one of our most important family gatherings? Before I could sink deeper into my thoughts, the DJ's voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, could I please have your attention? It's time for the speeches, starting with the groom, Daniel." I sat up slightly, curious. Despite myself, I'd only met Daniel a handful of times before today, and those meetings had been awkward, carefully orchestrated affairs where my mother ensured we had minimal interaction. But he had always seemed like a decent guy. Too decent, perhaps, for the family he was marrying into. Daniel took the microphone, looking nervous but happy as he stood beside Emma. "First, I want to thank everyone for coming today to celebrate with us," he began with the usual pleasantries. I tuned out, swirling the remaining champagne in my glass and considering a trip to the bar for something stronger. "But there's someone here who deserves special recognition," Daniel continued, his voice suddenly more serious. "Someone without whom I literally wouldn't be standing here today." I looked up, wondering which cousin or uncle was about to get a special shout-out. "James," Daniel said clearly into the microphone. "Emma's brother." The room went silent. I froze, my glass halfway to my lips. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me, including my mother's, which had widened in shock. 3 years ago, Daniel continued, I was trapped in a burning apartment building. As a firefighter, James was the one who found me when I was unconscious from smoke inhalation and carried me to safety. I didn't know until months later that he was Emma's brother. The silence in the room deepened. I could feel my mother's glare, burning into me, but I kept my eyes on Daniel. James never mentioned it to anyone in the family. He never used it to try to get closer to me or to influence my relationship with Emma. In fact, he's respected our space so much that this is only the 5th time I've ever met him in person. Daniel turned to look directly at me. "But I want you all to know that the man sitting alone at that table is the reason I'm alive today. He's the reason this wedding is happening at all. And he deserves better than to be sitting alone." My throat tightened as Daniel raised his glass. "To James. Thank you for my life." The room erupted in applause. Emma was staring at me, her mouth slightly open in shock. My father looked confused, and my mother looked like she'd been slapped. I'd never told them about saving Daniel. It hadn't seemed important at the time. I was just doing my job, and after years of being the family disappointment, I'd stopped sharing anything about my life with them. Why bother when my career choice was just another thing my mother held against me? I'd been 18 when I announced I wanted to be a firefighter instead of going to law school like she'd planned. My mother had never forgiven me for that choice. Common labor, she'd called it. Throwing away your potential. Nothing I accomplished in my career ever seemed to matter to her. Rising to lieutenant by age 30, receiving 2 commendations for bravery. None of it was enough to overcome the sin of not becoming a lawyer. As the applause died down, Daniel wasn't finished. In fact, James, if you wouldn't mind joining us up here, I'd be honored. I hesitated, then slowly stood. As I walked toward the head table, the crowd parted. Some guests were whispering to each other, clearly hearing this story for the first time. Emma's eyes were filled with tears. When I reached Daniel, he pulled me into a tight hug. "Thank you," he whispered again. Then, to my surprise, Emma embraced me too. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked quietly. "Would it have mattered?" I replied, just as quietly. A flicker of hurt crossed her face, but she didn't deny it. Years of following our mother's lead had created a distance between us that one revelation couldn't instantly bridge. Daniel kept his arm around my shoulders as he turned back to the guests. "I'd like to ask James to stay up here with us for the rest of the speeches. This is where family belongs." My mother's face was a storm of conflicting emotions. My father looked both proud and ashamed at the same time. But for once, neither of them controlled the narrative. For once, I wasn't being defined by their expectations or disappointment. I grew up as the son of Margaret and William Preston, 2 high-powered attorneys who expected nothing less than perfection from their children. Emma, 3 years my senior, had always been the golden child. Top of her class, president of the debate team, accepted to our parents' alma mater with a full scholarship. I was smart enough, but never quite measured up. When I showed more interest in sports than debate, my mother saw it as laziness. When I struggled with standardized tests due to undiagnosed dyslexia, she called it a lack of focus. By the time I was in high school, I'd internalized her judgment. I was the family disappointment, the one who would never quite be good enough. The breaking point came during my senior year. I'd become fascinated with emergency services after a firefighter spoke at our school. Something about the combination of physical challenge, practical problem-solving, and direct impact on people's lives called to me in a way nothing in my parents' world ever had. When I announced my plan to attend the fire academy instead of college, my mother didn't speak to me for 2 weeks. Eventually, she resorted to emotional manipulation. "If this is what you want to do with your life, fine. But don't expect us to celebrate mediocrity." I moved out the day after graduation. For the next decade, our relationship existed in a state of cold détente. I was invited to family functions but kept at arm's length. Tolerated but not embraced. Present but not truly included. Emma, eager to maintain peace and secure in her position as the successful child, rarely challenged this dynamic. I built my own life. I excelled in the fire service, made genuine friends, dated women who valued me for who I was rather than who my family expected me to be. But the wound of my family's rejection never fully healed. The fire that changed everything happened on a Tuesday night in March. It was a routine call-out to an apartment complex near downtown. By the time my unit arrived, the flames had engulfed 3 floors. We were conducting a standard sweep when I found him. A man in his early 30s, unconscious on his bathroom floor where he'd apparently tried to escape the smoke. I carried him out just before the ceiling collapsed. Later at the hospital, I learned his name, Daniel Walker. But it wasn't until he was being discharged that Emma arrived, and we realized the connection. She'd been dating him for a few months but hadn't introduced him to the family yet. The coincidence should have brought us closer. Instead, my mother somehow turned it into another failing on my part. "Of course you didn't recognize him as Emma's boyfriend. You never bothered to keep up with what's important in her life." After that, I was even more determined to keep my distance. I attended the obligatory holiday dinners and sent appropriate gifts for birthdays and anniversaries. But I protected myself by expecting nothing, sharing nothing, and asking for nothing. And then came the wedding invitation, addressed just to me, no +1, despite the fact that I'd been dating Sarah for almost a year. The final insult was the seating arrangement, placing me not with family, not with friends, but with distant acquaintances who didn't even know my name. Now, standing beside Emma and Daniel at their wedding, I felt decades of carefully constructed, emotional walls beginning to crack. Emma was crying openly now. "I'm so sorry, James," she whispered. "I should have stood up to Mom. I should have insisted you be treated better." I didn't know what to say. A lifetime of rejection doesn't get erased with one apology. But it was a start. Daniel, sensing the emotionally charged moment, smoothly took over the microphone again. "Since James is already up here, I'd like to ask him to say a few words, if he's willing." He offered me the microphone with a smile that held no judgment, no expectation, just an invitation to be heard, perhaps for the first time in that room. I took it, my hand slightly shaking. The silence was deafening as hundreds of guests, most of whom had been told various unflattering stories about me over the years, waited to hear what the black sheep would say. "I'm not much for public speaking," I began, my voice rougher than I'd expected. "But I want to congratulate Emma and Daniel. What I did that night was just my job, but what Daniel's doing today takes real courage. Committing to love and support another person for the rest of your life." I paused, looking at my sister. "Emma, we haven't always been close, but you'll always be my sister. I wish you both every happiness." I handed the microphone back, expecting that to be the end of it. But Emma took my hand and placed the microphone back in it. "Tell them the rest," she said softly, "about what happened after the fire." I swallowed, hard. This was the part I'd kept to myself, the part that hurt too much to share. After I pulled Daniel from the fire, I suffered some burns and smoke inhalation myself. I spent 3 days in the hospital. I looked at my mother as I continued. "I called home once. Dad answered. When I told him what happened, he said he'd tell Mom and that they'd visit. They never came." A murmur went through the crowd. My father looked down at his hands. My mother's face had gone completely white. "But Daniel came," I continued. "Every day of those 3 days, even though he was recovering himself. He brought me real coffee to replace the hospital stuff. He thanked me. He treated me with more respect in those 3 days than my family had in years." I turned to Daniel. "You don't owe me anything. Saving you was my job, and my honor. But your friendship afterward? That was a gift I'll never forget." The applause that followed was thunderous. Daniel hugged me again, and Emma joined in. Over her shoulder, I saw my father stand up. To my shock, there were tears running down his face. My mother remained seated, her expression unreadable. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I was moved to the family table, where distant relatives who had long avoided me now wanted to hear all about my career. Several of Emma's friends confessed they'd always wondered about her mysterious brother, and my father, after 3 scotches, pulled me aside and did something I couldn't remember him ever doing before. He apologized. "I failed you," he said simply. "I let your mother dictate how we treated you, and I knew it was wrong. I have no excuse." "Where is Mom?" I asked, noticing her absence. "She left," he replied. "Said she had a migraine. But between us, I think she couldn't handle not being in control of the narrative anymore." As the night wound down, I found myself on the dance floor with Emma for the sibling dance that hadn't originally been on the program. As we swayed to the music, she looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Can we start over?" she asked. "I know it's a lot to ask, but I've missed my brother." I thought about all the years of hurt, the missed opportunities, the countless times I'd needed family and found myself alone. It wouldn't be easy to forgive. It might take years to rebuild trust, but looking at my sister's hopeful face, I realized I wanted to try. "One day at a time," I said finally. She nodded, understanding that this was neither a promise of immediate forgiveness nor a rejection of the possibility. Later, as I helped Daniel load some of the wedding gifts into their car, he gripped my shoulder. "Thank you for not embarrassing Margaret, even though you could have." I shrugged. What would be the point? Today was about you and Emma, not old family drama. "You're a better man than most," he said seriously, and I meant what I said in there. "You're family to me now, whether Margaret likes it or not." Driving home that night, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because everything was suddenly fixed. It wasn't, and might never be completely. But for the first time in my adult life, I'd been seen. Not as the family disappointment or the black sheep, but as exactly who I was. A man who had chosen a different path, but one worthy of respect. 2 days later, a knock at my apartment door revealed Emma and Daniel, still looking tanned from their brief honeymoon weekend. "We wanted to invite you to dinner," Emma said. "Just us. A fresh start." Behind them, parked at the curb, I could see my father waiting in his car. He raised a hand in tentative greeting. I hesitated for just a moment before nodding. "I'd like that." It wouldn't be easy. There would be difficult conversations ahead, boundaries to establish, trust to rebuild. My mother might never truly accept me, but standing in that doorway, looking at my sister's hopeful face and her husband's genuine smile, I realized something important. Family isn't just what you're born into. Sometimes it's what you build. One difficult, honest conversation at a time. It had taken a wedding, a public acknowledgement, and years of pain to get us to this point. But as I closed my apartment door and joined them, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a very long time. Hope. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful real-life stories of redemption and healing. Each like helps us reach more people with stories that remind us of the power of truth, courage, and second chances.